Hello, this is a video to explain the last section of issue 2. It's the fifth factor, divisions in the black community. Obviously, this is one of the ones that I wanted to talk you through in class, but unfortunately circumstances mean that I can't. So I thought it would be more sensible to try and make you a video of it. So you can take your notes, and then get a little bit of context and explanation around as to what the issue is actually about, in case it's ones that you decide to write about. So it is divisions in the black community. This is really around how the black community began to organize themselves into some groups to try and improve the lives of black people. But unfortunately, even though all the groups were set up with good intentions and did have the ultimate goal of improving the lives of black people, they had very different methods of approaching things. They had very different ideologies, and in fact, in some cases, they didn't really like each other very much. And that obviously meant things were more difficult to get resolved because these three groups were not working together. And as we saw, for example, in things like the Montgomery bus boycott later on, black people, when they do unite, do have a very, very strong economic power. At this time, obviously, their economic power wasn't as strong, but just by uniting people together, they would have made a difference. But unfortunately, in this case, the numbers involved were quite small, and because they didn't unite together, it did make it more difficult for them to be successful. So we're going to look at three groups in total. The first one is linked to a gentleman called Booker T. Washington. On the screen now, you should see a picture of him. He's the son of a slave. He believed very much in black education as a method to improve black lives. He wasn't looking to get necessarily equality between black and white people. He just felt that if black people took their education seriously, if they were able to focus on maybe jobs that they could do, it mentions in the slides about practical skills regarding farming, carpentry, brickmaking, and stuff like that. If they could do those jobs very, very well, and develop themselves a trade, firstly they had the opportunity to get some money and perhaps improve their economic standing, but also because they would become hopefully respected members of the community, that would mean that potentially they could obviously improve their lives and get better opportunities as they kind of developed. He did actually found his own school, which is now a university. He use that to try as a foundation for the education stuff that he did. Now, one of the more unpopular things that Washington advocated was he felt that black people shouldn't try and antagonize white people, and they shouldn't push to be equal. He felt that if they work hard and get educated, they would earn that respect. Now, at the bottom of the slide, there's something about Uncle Tom. You don't need to write that down. Just the context of Uncle Tom is Uncle Tom was a literary character from about 50 years before the time of Booker Washington being involved in this sort of stuff. And it was basically someone who was very, I suppose you could almost argue, just basically very agreeable to anything that white people said, and wasn't a slave, was very much a servant, or kind of just felt themselves to be very, very inferior to white people. And Booker T. Washington did kind of gain probably an unfair reputation of being a bit like that. His approach was different from the others, so we're going to meet a gentleman called Webb Du Bois. And Webb Du Bois, in theory, him and Booker T. Washington should have been very, very close because of the thing they were trying to achieve, but actually they didn't like each other very much and never really worked together. But Washington, one of the things he did do was that he did work with presidents. So Booker T. Washington died in 1915, but by that point he was an advisor to Woodrow Wilson, who was the president at the time, and he was advisor to the previous president as well. And he was seen as being quite respected. He was someone who did achieve things and help improve the lives of black people. The university he founded is now absolutely huge. It's very, very successful. And even at the time, people were giving it quite a lot of money to try and help it develop. But one of his probably negative things, and this is maybe we're going to think about your analysis plus, is about the fact that he wasn't popular because his approach was not necessarily to make black and white people more equal. It was to get black people more respected to the education that they did. And actually, you could argue that some of the stuff that he put in place has had a more longer term effect, and maybe his process was actually right, because obviously education is a very, very important thing. But that's obviously something you decide when you argue. And this is a picture here with the president, and you can see Lincoln on the back wall there as well. Very exciting picture. So the next person we're going to talk about is Webb Du Bois, and he is the founder of the NAACP. For those of you who can't remember what that stands for, it is on the slides. National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. This was the first civil rights movement, founded in 1909, and it had a very, very wide remit. It was basically around trying to end segregation and to get equal opportunities for black people, which in 1909 is a very, very big ask. And the organisation, we don't really see it being hugely successful until the 1950s, when it starts to challenge the kind of status quo and starts kind of organising some court cases, and becoming much, much stronger. But I think sometimes there's the kind of idea that it's a very new organisation then, but obviously it's been around by that point for nearly 40 years, and it has achieved some things, but perhaps not as much as it achieves later on. However, it is a good example of an organisation that is there to make life better for black people. And it did have some successes. So it campaigned against lynching, but obviously, as we've seen in other bits, it wasn't necessarily successful because the Anti-Lynching Act, the Dyer Act, was not successful. But one of the things it did do, it took the various states to the Supreme Court and got the grandfather clause declared unconstitutional. Remember, the grandfather clause was designed to stop black people from voting, because it said that your father or your grandfather had to be able to vote before you could vote. But of course, the date that they chosen was a time when most black people didn't actually have a vote. So you see there as well, it did have 91,000 members, which is quite a significant proportion of the population. But one of the difficulties you had, it kind of was seen as being a bit of an elite group, where lots of white people were involved in it, and it was kind of more well-off black people, or more wealthier black people, a bit like Du Bois himself, who was obviously very well educated, having had a Harvard degree. Its policy of using the courts kind of stems from the fact that Du Bois did have that Harvard degree, and it did kind of help that process kind of be developed later on. But as we see later on, one of the challenges that actually the NAACP had was that various states started to ban it from their courthouses, which obviously made it more difficult. Him and Washington were not very popular, but one of the things that perhaps was maybe a benefit was because both parties were kind of trying to do different things at the same time, that perhaps you could argue that maybe black people were benefiting from both approaches at the same time, even though neither was completely successful. But as I said, if you want to maybe make a comparison between the two, it might be worth your while. Now, the final person to talk about is Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey has kind of become one of the more forgotten figures of black civil rights. And he's a very interesting character. I think I posted something on Teams a few days ago with a link to a website about him. He's a very, very interesting person to read about. Last year when I did Higher History, I used to have this thing about the dictator of Italy, Benito Mussolini, and I would always try and find a picture of him with a hat, which wasn't too hard because he always wore hats. I found quite a few pictures of Garvey with a hat on as well, and they're pretty cool hats too. But anyway, he was very much someone who, his ideas actually in some ways kind of still around today, and maybe continue to influence the kind of development of black rights. So he felt black pride in being black and black culture are very, very important. The organization he founded was Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA, and he just basically saw that he thought it was difficult for things to change. He thought that potentially all white people were, I suppose, potentially racist or potentially Klansmen. That's a hard argument to make, given that there were some white people involved in some of the other organizations that we've had a look at. But certainly it did make him want or try and encourage black people to kind of almost shake off white culture and be more in touch with their heritage. He did actually have the idea that the black population of America should just leave America and go back to Africa and start their own country there. Which in some ways is a bit of a weird thing, because I guess that was often one of the insults that was thrown at black people at the time was, why don't you just go back to Africa? I suppose when I kind of think about that, I maybe have the idea of the kind of Black Panther type film thing where they have their own super state there, and it's really, really successful. And perhaps maybe Garvey had a kind of a similar idea, but obviously it never happened. But his idea of, Africa is a very, very poor continent, so to organize it, develop it, arm it, and make it the defender of Negroes over the world, I guess that's kind of, it was a very, very big dream. His kind of story ends a bit sadly, because eventually he was convicted for fraud. He was involved in an awful lot of other businesses. He had a lot of ideas. He was always trying to kind of change things and kind of get things moving. But eventually he either overreached himself, or he was involved in something that perhaps was a bit dodgy. Because there was, I think, a business he was organising, or a company he was organising, and he missold stocks in it. And a lot of people lost a lot of money. And he was convicted of fraud and then deported. But I would imagine that the fact that he got deported would probably indicate that perhaps the authorities were quite concerned about him anyway. As with the other two leaders, he didn't really link up very well with them. They had different ideas. But actually, I suppose the thing to think about as well is that by the time Garvey comes along, although the work that Washington did is still taking place, Washington himself dies in 1915, so there's probably not much of an overlap between those two. But certainly Webb Du Bois was around when Garvey was around, but they did not work together. I guess the last thing to think about Garvey is, while he was alive, you could very much argue that he didn't achieve anything near what I guess he would have hoped to have done. But when you think about some of the things like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers later on, that his ideas of strong black leadership and strong black pride and sense of culture, those things do definitely reappear, particularly after the assassination of Martin Luther King, when there's a kind of a void in the leadership in the black community, and younger activists are coming to the fore. Some of the ideas of Garvey and the Garvey had are kind of reinstated as well and listened to again. So that's kind of just the last bit on that. It's just to remember that although these organizations weren't hugely successful in their time, they kind of did lay the kind of foundations for some of the stuff that came along in the 1950s that was much more successful. Even A. Philip Randolph in the 1940s would have kind of helped pave the way for that as well. But because they weren't unified, it made it more difficult, and because they had different aims, different methods, different ideologies, it meant they weren't speaking in one voice, which meant in some ways it was harder for the government to try and listen to all three organisations and try and change things when all three were asking for different things to be changed. And as I said, the leaders didn't get on as much, though obviously in the case of Garvey and Washington, that was always difficult to do anyway. But obviously one of the things we're looking for Martin Luther King later on is when he becomes prominent in the civil rights movement. One of the things he does very, very successfully is that he kind of unites all the black organisations behind him, and then they're all very much moulded in his idea of how things can change, which obviously didn't happen here. So again, maybe something to think about when you're maybe making comparisons about success or otherwise of these things. And that's it on that. So that is section 5 done, factor 5 done on the issue number 2. Hopefully it's a benefit. If you have any questions on it, please drop me a note or post on Teams, and I will try and get back to you as quickly as possible. And hopefully this all makes sense. Thank you.